My name is Ethan Gould, and I'm going to be talking about my thesis, Pericardia, and also about the concept of layers and some other stuff. You can't have layers without having something come before something else, unless it's two-flavored soft-serve ice cream or those Play-Doh Fun Factory nozzles that come out in like small tubes, or somebody just hands you a stack of Oreos. But most of the time, layers mean grappling with time. And structure and time go together hand in hand. Pericardia is a graphic novelette rendered in a children's book style about Val, a junker struggling to survive in Pericardia, a city that never stops building atop itself layer after layer of new eras and neighborhoods. This project distills and, builds upon a lot of the themes that have been a part of my work, including layered history and imagination, childhood and adulthood, the working world, the body and environments, illness, and recovery. Val's life of climbing the city for sellable items is complicated by a bizarre condition that causes the afflicted skin to mix up their environment and themselves and grow architecture. Despite the hazards this illness causes, it gives Val a feeling of kinship with Pericardia, since both are on the verge of falling apart. Val is recruited by the Pericardia Civil Corps, an ancient guild union responsible for keeping the city working, no matter how complicated it becomes. Entri, an enthusiastic team leader, has to convince Val that the place as complex and unique as Pericardia, the ability to merge with or even speak with the city on a literally visceral level, makes Val a vital contributor to helping the world. In this way, Val moves from isolation and recovery as they recover lost technologies for repairing the city. Everyone's first layer is childhood. The process of developing my project started with thinking about world building and environments and project making. Imagination was more important to me than anything growing up. I grew up in a quiet suburb with X number of roads and Y number of trees, and lacking any sort of historical context for an environment like this, the environment ends up being filled with imagination. It gets filled up with entities and places and scenarios and collaborative play. And let's just face it, childhood is basically bananas left untrammeled. There was this other situation behind the framework of the world, and it just seemed obvious at every turn. But that being said, why cities and structures and machines and a civil service, all these very adult themes? I grew up in an artistic family, but for that specifically, I'd have to talk about my grandpa, an engineer and a geologist, a very large influence on my life. The archetypical practical man. There wasn't a factory or a mine on God's green earth he wouldn't take me to, or a practical skill he wouldn't try and teach me. To learn about the real world of industry, building, and science, and history. Of course, the fluorescent dinosaur kingdom brain has other ideas, so I ended up with a knack for impossible structure, what-if structure. I used to draw hundreds of fake factories, houses for animals, more houses for animals. I mean, the real world versus the schematics of, say, hamburger cyborgs. This is the kind of childhood that haunts an adulthood, the idea of adulthood. Moving to New York City, there was a joke between my grandpa and I that no matter what neighborhood I went to, he was there first decades ago. You wind up having a recurring history overlaid on top of your own burgeoning history. Near my block right now is a converted vaudeville theater turned movie house turned now a technical college, but it was once the theater that he served popcorn in the 1920s as a child. Memories and layers and imagination and the past. In designing Pericardia, the layering of imaginative space onto the real was obviously super important. There are so many forms and strange structures in the city that if you squint right, you start to see the possibilities of a veiled city, the city that might be. The city is already constantly changing and layering and under construction, but taking those elements and bringing them to the forefront, a whole new way of looking at a built environment can develop. I started capturing process images of structure with this imagination in mind. When something looked Pericardia, it went into a burgeoning folder, and after a while, collage seemed like an interesting and honest way to capture that honestly childhood feeling in an adult context. And stuff. Children's literature is often about helping a child on their journey to adulthood, thinking about their place in society and their vocation in ways that a child might not necessarily understand until later. Most children want to become adults. I'm interested in what happens when things break down and they're dizzy in complexity. Our world changes so rapidly now that roles delineated for children become outdated in a single decade. Adulthood is marked by setbacks, by illnesses, by death, and all of the things that are usually outside of the purview of the childhood imagination. In making something reflecting on work and play in work and the way that adulthood and childhood reverberate back and forth with each other, I wanted to piece of that sort of impractical diagram, a constantly shifting diagram, adulthood within childhood and childhood within adulthood, to find out what that would look like. My previous artwork as an adult has been about fictional structure all the way. Fictional biology, fictional anatomy, fictional architecture, of course, fictional anthropology, but after a while I had drawn myself into a bit of an oubliette, with tight obsessive line work that, while engaging, was starting to feel enclosing rather than expansive. In making Pericardia, I wanted to recover a feeling of playfulness even when dealing with adult contexts and situations, that sort of rocket ship, hamburger, cyborg childhood aesthetic, and place it into a world where we have to recover the things that are important to us to truly make it as an adult. Thanks very much. The pericardial sac is the tough outer layering of the heart, and Val's journey as a character is one of going from isolation and a standoffishness to letting other people in and becoming more associated and integrated within society, finding a place in it. And it just seemed anatomically to be something that worked. But to be honest, the name actually came before the project. It's a name that I had thought up a while ago that I just found really cool. And when I started thinking about this project, I pulled out my tickler file and I was like, oh, this is what the name of the city is. This is perfect. I usually start with dualities. I really like writing protagonist and duotagonist, and I typically have pairings. So I'll think about different opposites. If Val is standoffish, then Entri is a character who's exuberant and warm. If Val is cynical, then Entri is earnest. It even got to the point where, in thinking about the different layers of the city, some of the old-timey layers have different cultures, while the ones on top are more mechanistic. So the people who come from the Pericardia Civil Corps all come from a borough called Machine County, and they don't even use contractions in a very specific technical vocabulary. So all that world building wound up just thinking about opposites in the beginning. And after that, with those constraints in mind, I tend to just start working with dialogue and find what's fun and what I like. Well, it was always going to be a comic book. I knew that I wanted to include diagrams and some writing in it to try and capture those sort of like bureaucratic ideas that are the opposite of childhood. I originally had a different style in mind for this project, but as it developed, this sort of like unruly, messier sort of style just sort of came out of nowhere, and I started really thinking back on why I was doing this and what was happening. And it was actually quite a struggle for me to sort of let go and let loose and let things be messier and let them be more colorful. But I like the color palette most of all surprised me, because originally I had thought about it only in black and white with maybe a couple spot colors. But sort of letting go of those ideas and sort of letting it go where it needed to was pretty surprising. At first, no. When you're sort of struggling with a new kind of medium, and comic books for me, or even sequential imagery, is very new for me. So I spent a lot of time working with my mentor, learning the bones of that. And that was an incredibly rewarding process, because it's all about structure and it's all about acquiring this new vocabulary and thinking about stuff differently. But despite all of that, I kept wanting it to be the same sort of like very tight, very obsessive line style that I'd been doing professionally for a number of years at that point. And it really wasn't until later in the process that I started finally like letting go. And even that was sort of like, it had some growing pains to it. But honestly, I do really like the outcome, because it's such a surprise, and that's so rare in art, to like really be surprised by your own work. It also happened pretty naturally. I started playing around because the story has like these dualities in it of like dual characters and, you know, being outside versus inside. And in thinking more about childhood, there's always these very poppy colors that are used. But if you go back to like a certain era, especially the work of Richard Scarry, there's like, I always, even as a kid, kind of felt that there was something like a little bit melancholy about the color palette. And I don't know if that's simply how things were printed back then, or they couldn't be as vivid as things are today. But I was trying to remember that like emotional feeling to it. And Val's journey is a little bit melancholy, going from such extreme isolation and dealing with medical maladies and so on. So I wanted to create that sort of like childhood context of, oh, look at these colorful different city layers. They're so messy and interesting, but then still kind of have a little bit of that shabbiness to it, because the city is always under construction and not in that fun childhood way. But in terms of having the different colors be what they were, the only real one that I thought of ahead of time was that the top layer had to be blue, and it had to be blue and gray because it was the most modern one, and that's where like the skyscrapers were going to be. But other than that, a lot of it just sort of developed naturally. Thanks.